Uzwa. In the late 1980s, there was an elderly man living in a mid-sized Oregon town that had been founded by Finnish settlers generations earlier. He was a local fixture, well known around the community, despite holding some prejudiced attitudes about race. Born sometime around 1915, he spent virtually his entire life since the age of 2 in the same Victorian-era townhouse. People often joke that after all these years, the man and his aging home has started to mirror each other, both weathered and grey. When doctors diagnosed him with terminal colon cancer and gave him 6 months, the news spread quickly through town. It affected people deeply. The old man used his remaining time to say his goodbyes and settle things with the people in his life. On a clear, cold night around 3 a.m, police received a call from one of his neighbours. She was worried because she hadn't seen him in several days and the house had been completely dark. 2 officers responded to do a welfare check, fearing they already knew what they'd find. Their patrol car woke up several people on the street when they arrived. Neighbours stepped outside, and once they understood what was happening, some began to cry. The officers found the front door open and went inside. The first thing that caught their attention was a large taxidermied elk head hanging in the entrance hall. Its glass eyes seemed to follow them as they passed. They headed upstairs and entered the old man's bedroom, where they discovered him on the floor next to his bed, which hadn't been slept in. They checked for vital signs and confirmed what everyone had suspected. He was gone. The officers radioed for an ambulance to come collect the body and take it to the coroner. Because it was such a small town, only one paramedic was available to respond. When he arrived, he asked the 2 officers to assist him in bringing the body down to the ambulance outside. It was during this process that things took a disturbing turn. The 3 men started down the staircase carrying the body, but they were having difficulty managing the weight. That's when the lead officer glanced over at the elk head in the entryway and froze. Something had changed. When they had first walked past it, the head had been mounted facing forward normally. Now it was twisted to one side. Below it, written on the wall in something wet and red, was a single word, Azwa. The officer's skin crawled. His grandparents had spoken Finnish, so he recognized the word immediately. It meant stay or remain. He touched the red writing and brought his fingers to his nose. It was blood, and it was dripping down from the elk head. Shaken, he shouted to his partner and the paramedic about what he was seeing. They quickly became just as frightened. The paramedic made the call that they needed to get out of there immediately and told the first officer to run ahead and open up the ambulance so they could load the body quickly. The officer agreed and bolted for the door. The instant he stepped off the porch, every siren and light on both vehicles activated simultaneously. The sudden blast of noise and flashing lights was overwhelming, sending neighbours who'd been watching scrambling back towards their homes. Now seriously scared, the officer forced open the ambulance's rear doors and looked back towards the house to check on the others. His partner and the paramedic had managed to get the stretcher onto the porch when every single window in the house suddenly shattered inwards all at once. The sound was deafening. What the officer witnessed next didn't make any physical sense. The porch didn't collapse from structural failure or weight. It simply gave out, as if the house itself had surrendered. The entire front section and porch sagged forward with the sharp crack of breaking timber, forming an angled slope leading up to where the second-story window had been. A cloud of dust filled the air. Neighbours came running back to help. The officer rushed around to the side of the collapsed structure, squeezing through the space between the caved-in roof and the walls that were still partially standing. Inside, he found his partner in shock, trembling and muttering incoherently. All he could make out at first was the phrase, "He sat up," repeated over and over. It took several minutes to calm him down enough to get a coherent explanation. According to his partner, as the porch was collapsing around them, the old man's corpse had torn through the body bag and let out a horrible scream. The first officer went to check the body bag himself. It was shredded completely. The corpse was positioned sitting upright, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. Disturbed and wanting to shield others from the sight, he grabbed a tarp and covered it. His partner was still too traumatized to go anywhere near the house. The town's second ambulance was called in. It transported the shaken officer and the paramedic to a trauma center for evaluation. The first officer remained at the scene to handle the incident report, though it's hard to imagine what he could have written that would accurately capture what had occurred. How do you officially document a house that collapsed on its own and a dead man clawing his way out of a body bag? In the years since, the story has become part of local folklore. The house remains standing exactly as it was that night, partially collapsed and abandoned. No one in town has been willing to touch it or go near it since. A childish haunting. This story comes from a small rural town in Nebraska in the early 1990s. At the time, the town had several abandoned buildings that police were told to check regularly. Heavy industry had been leaving the area for years, and many families had moved away, leaving their homes empty. One building in particular had been hit by copper thieves before, so officers were supposed to keep a close watch on it. One officer, working alone like most did in the small town, was making his evening rounds when he drove past this house. It sat on a corner lot, so all four sides were visible from the street. His first pass was around 7 in the evening. The building was in rough shape, paint peeling off, windows boarded up, just another empty shell with nothing going on. Snow was starting to accumulate, especially around houses where no one was clearing or salting the walkways. The officer was settling in for what looked like another long, quiet night. About 2 hours later, he came by again on his patrol route and noticed the back door of the house was standing wide open. He knew for certain it hadn't been opened the last time it passed. Naturally, he figured someone had broken in again. He pulled over to check it out, though he wondered what could possibly be left to steal from that gutted place. When he got to the house, something struck him as odd. There were no footprints in the snow around the open door. Confused but not particularly concerned, he radioed dispatch to let them know that he was investigating an open door at that address and asked for a county sheriff to start heading his way. The officer walked up to the door, still puzzled by the lack of footprints, and shined his flashlight inside. Thieves had stripped the place bare over the years. The plaster walls were torn down, and piles of rubbish and debris covered the floor. He didn't see anyone in the room, and there were no footprints in the dust or on the floor either. With no prints in the snow or inside, he figured the wind must have blown the door open. He was about to close and secure it when he heard a loud thump from upstairs, followed by what sounded like children laughing. He called up to them, but got no response, just more sounds of kids playing and laughing. He radioed dispatch again to let them know he thought the intruders would probably be just some kids messing around in the house. He carefully made his way through the kitchen towards the living room where the stairs were, checking every corner as he went. Many of the floorboards were rotted, and he had to watch his step carefully as he moved through the rooms. While he was making his way through the house, he heard noises upstairs 2 more times. With no verbal response to his calls, he started thinking it might be an animal. Still, he could have sworn it sounded like children laughing. He figured he had to check it out regardless, so he started up the stairs to find the source of the sounds. As soon as he did, everything went eerily quiet. The upstairs wasn't particularly large. He heard a thump in the bedroom to his left. Not sure what he'd find, he carefully approached the door and looked around the edge. The room was empty except for a pile of debris and broken furniture. Strangely, there was a fresh piece of paper sitting on top of the pile. The officer walked over to examine it and found it was a page torn from a children's book. More disturbing, though, was that someone had drawn a picture of a police officer on it in crayon. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he heard the children's laughter again, this time right behind him. He spun around, gun raised, but no one was there. The officer left the house immediately, told dispatch it was a false alarm, and refused to ever go back to that place again. The Reanimated Woman. This story takes place in rural Illinois, where two police officers were working the night shift. It was usually quiet work, dealing with the odd drunk or speeding violation here and there. That night, they got a call about a possible break-in at the local morgue. Strange place for a break-in, sure, but morgues keep various chemicals that might interest someone looking for drugs. The officers responded and drove over to check it out. When they arrived, they found the custodian waiting outside, visibly shaken. He explained that while mopping the floors, it caught movement in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, he saw someone dash across the hallway and disappear into one of the rooms. He couldn't give them much of a description. He'd turned the lights off while cleaning, but he was certain he'd seen someone, and being alone and unarmed, he decided to call for backup rather than investigate himself. The officers figured it was probably kids messing around, or maybe the custodian's eyes playing tricks on him, but he seemed sure enough that they'd agreed to take a look. They called out a warning first, announcing that anyone inside should show themselves. No response, just their voices bouncing back through the empty building. The officers and custodian began walking through the main corridor, hands on their weapons, checking each side room as they went. Most were analysis labs, with some storage areas for equipment and files. They switched on lights as they moved, making sure no one could hide in the darkness. One officer opened a door to a dark room and searched for the light switch. It turned out to be an empty waiting area for families of the deceased. He quickly swept the room, checking anywhere someone could be hiding. While he was doing this, his partner suddenly shouted, "Hey, stop! Turn around!" He spun around to see his partner with his gun drawn, aimed towards the end of the corridor. "She went around the corner," his partner said, pointing to the left turn at the corridor's end. "That's a dead end down there," the custodian told them. "No way out." Knowing they had whoever it was trapped, the officers moved down the corridor, calling out to the woman that she'd be safe if she came out peacefully. The first officer reached the end and looked around the corner. There she was, standing at the far end. The lights were still off in that section, but he could make out her silhouette and long, light-coloured hair. He stepped out from the corner, hoping to talk her into coming quietly. The moment she saw him, though, she yanked open a large grey door behind her and ran through, slamming it shut. The officer rushed to the door and found it locked. He pounded on it and called for the woman to come out, but got no answer. His partner arrived with the custodian, and when he explained what happened, the custodian looked concerned. According to him, the door couldn't be locked from the inside. He unlocked it, and the two officers went in, weapons ready. They swept their flashlights across the room, but saw everything except the woman they were looking for. The beams of light made the place feel unsettling, and one officer noticed it seemed unusually cold even for a morgue. The custodian came in after them and hit the lights, flooding the room with fluorescent brightness. It was mostly bare, some workstations along the walls, equipment stacked against one side, and two gurneys in the centre. One gurney had a sheet draped over it with the shape of a body underneath. It would have been a decent hiding spot if the room saw regular use, but as things stood, the officers knew exactly where their suspect was. As they got closer to the gurney, they sensed something wasn't right. An awful smell was coming from under the sheet. Not the smell of someone living, not even someone who hadn't bathed in days, but the distinct odour of decay. When the officers pulled back the sheet, they found the woman they'd been chasing through the building. A toe tag dangled from her foot, marking a date of death as 4 days earlier.